Hey everyone, welcome to Haunted Midnight. I upload true stories every week on my channel, so if you enjoy this video, check out my other videos. Before we begin, over 90% of you are not subscribed. It would be amazing if you guys can subscribe and support me, as I am still a small channel. Thank you for watching. I should have known from the start that the night was going to go badly. Not in an obvious, screaming red flag kind of way, but in that slow, creeping way where little things start to pile up, and by the time you realize it, you're already in too deep. But at that point, you tell yourself to just get through it, to be polite, to not make a scene. I always do that. I always ignore my gut feeling and just push through. This time, I regretted it. I met him on a dating app. His name was Eric. He seemed normal enough, maybe a little plain, but normal was fine. His photos weren't suspicious, just a few of him at the gym, one with a dog, one of him standing in front of a car that may or may not have been his. He messaged first, which I liked, and he wasn't overly flirty or creepy. Just basic conversation, nothing memorable, but also nothing weird. I was getting tired of the whole dating app cycle, talking for weeks and never meeting. So, when he asked me out after a few days, I said yes. We picked a restaurant that was nice but not too fancy, a safe, neutral place. I got there early, as I always do, just to settle in. It was a little cozy spot, dimly lit but not too dark. The kind of place where people actually sat down and had conversations instead of just drinking and shouting over loud music. I found a table near the back and ordered a drink while I waited. Eric was late, not by much, maybe 10 minutes, but there was no text, no heads up. He just walked in like he wasn't late at all, like I should have expected it. The first thing I noticed was that he wasn't as put together as he was in his photos. He looked similar, but there was something off. His posture maybe, or the way he carried himself. His expression was flat, almost uninterested, like he wasn't here to impress anyone. He sat down without much of a greeting. No smile, no small talk. He barely looked at me before grabbing the menu, flipping through it like he was scanning for something specific. I tried to start a conversation, but he wasn't giving me much. His answers were short, clipped, and he didn't ask anything in return. He wasn't nervous. If anything, he seemed completely indifferent to the fact that this was a first date. When the waitress came over, he ordered immediately, cutting me off before I could even say what I wanted. His voice was sharp, almost dismissive, and he didn't even look at her. He spoke like she was beneath him, like she was just an obstacle between him and his food. That made my stomach twist a little. I've always believed that how a person treats service workers says a lot about them. This wasn't a good sign. The food came, and he ate fast, too fast. He barely looked up, just shoveled food into his mouth like he hadn't eaten in days. Meanwhile, I was trying to pace myself, cutting small bites, and hoping the conversation would get better. It didn't. He kept checking his phone, scrolling through something while I sat there, slowly realizing that this wasn't just a bad date. It was a complete waste of time. Then he started talking about money. It came out of nowhere, like he had been waiting for the right moment. He went on about how expensive things were, how dating was a scam, how women expected too much from men financially. The way he spoke wasn't casual. It was bitter, almost resentful. I just nodded along, barely responding, trying to get through the meal without engaging too much. Then the check came, and he didn't touch it. He didn't even look at it, just leaned back, crossed his arms, and stared at me like it was my problem. I waited for him to say something to acknowledge it, but he didn't. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I wasn't expecting him to pay for me. I had no problem splitting the bill. But the way he was just sitting there, waiting for me to react, made me uneasy. It felt deliberate, like a test. I reached for my wallet just to break the tension, and the second I did, he exhaled sharply, almost like a laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh, though. It was smug, satisfied, like he had been expecting this exact moment and was pleased with how it played out. That's when I realized. This was his thing. He had planned this. He wasn't just refusing to pay. He was enjoying watching me squirm. I felt my face get hot, but I didn't say a word. I just handed my card to the waitress, signed the receipt, and stood up. He didn't thank me, didn't acknowledge it, just sat there, watching me leave. Later that night, I got a message from him. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a Venmo request for his half of the meal. I blocked him immediately, but the feeling didn't go away because I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how many women had sat across from him, feeling that same slow, creeping discomfort, about how many had ignored the signs, just like I did, and about how many would still fall into the same trap. I should have known something was off the moment I stepped into the dimly lit cafe. The whole thing felt weird from the start, but I ignored the nagging feeling in my gut because I was tired of overthinking. I had been talking to this girl, Lisa, for a few weeks online. She seemed cool, pretty funny, had this laid-back attitude that made our conversations easy. Her photos showed a woman in her late 20s, dark hair, sharp features, this sort of effortless beauty that didn't feel fake or overly filtered. I wasn't expecting a model, but she definitely looked good. So there I was, standing by the entrance of this cafe, scanning the room for the face I had memorized from her pictures. But instead of the confident, stylish woman I had been talking to, I saw someone waving at me from the corner booth. At first, I didn't even recognize her. I hesitated, wondering if she was just someone sitting near my actual date. But then she waved again, and there was this look of recognition on her face. My stomach dropped. She looked nothing like her photos. I'm not talking about minor differences. This was full-on deception. She had used photos from at least 10 years ago, maybe more. Her hair was thinner, her face fuller, her entire presence just felt different. Not that she was unattractive, but the betrayal of expectations hit me like a brick. I walked over, feeling my brain scramble for how to react. I forced a smile, sat down, and told myself to just push through. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe she had just been insecure. The moment I sat down, I could tell something was off. Her energy was strange, too eager, too intense. She immediately launched into conversation as if we were already in a relationship, bringing up personal things I had mentioned in passing, things I barely even remembered telling her. It was like she had studied me. Every detail I had shared, she clung to like it was part of some script she had rehearsed. She kept touching my arm, laughing at things that weren't funny, and talking way too fast. I felt trapped in my own body, stuck between politeness and the overwhelming urge to leave. I tried to steer the conversation into something casual, but she always brought it back to something asterisk into an asterisk. She told me about her past relationships in disturbing detail, how men had used her up and left, how she always knew we would connect. She said she had this feeling about me, that she knew I was different. I nodded, tried to be polite, but my skin was crawling. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. Not just any notebook. It was filled, cover to cover, with handwritten notes. She flipped it open, showing me pages and pages of what looked like a diary. My name was everywhere. She had been writing about me, about our conversations, about things I had never even told her. She had guessed details of my life, things that were eerily accurate, and had written them down as if she was documenting our love story before it even happened. I felt sick. I tried to laugh it off, but my hands were shaking under the table. I made up some excuse about needing to use the bathroom, my mind racing with how to escape. But as I stood up, she grabbed my wrist, hard. She looked up at me with this expression I can only describe as desperate. She said she had waited for me, that she knew I would come, that she had seen this happen before . I ripped my arm away and made a beeline for the exit. I didn't care if I looked like a jerk. I didn't care about being polite anymore. I just needed to be gone . I rushed out into the cold night air, my heart hammering in my chest. As I walked away, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. Text after text, all from her. Messages that didn't make sense. Things like I knew you'd run and you're just like the others . I blocked her. I didn't look back. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that notebook, about how much she'd written, about how much she knew . The next morning, I got an email. It was from a burner account. It was just one line. You can hide from fate, I moved cities a month later. I should have known something was off about him from the start, but I guess I was too caught up in the idea of finally having a normal date. I've been on so many bad ones before. Boring guys, rude guys, ones that made me want to fake an emergency phone call just to get out of there. So when I matched with Chris, he seemed like a decent choice. His profile was simple, no over-the-top gym selfies or weird captions, just a few pictures of him looking like a normal guy and a bio that didn't make me cringe. We talked for a few days, nothing too deep, and he asked me out for dinner. I figured, why not? The restaurant was one of those mid-tier places, not super fancy but still nice enough that it felt like an actual date instead of a casual meetup. I got there first, like I always do. I thought I'd be early, scope out the place, get a feel for things. When he walked in, he looked like his pictures, but there was something about him that felt different in person. It wasn't that he was unattractive, but he had this strange energy about him, like he was overly comfortable, too sure of himself for a first date. No nervousness, no effort to impress, just this weird confidence, like he already knew how the night was going to go. He sat down across from me, leaned back in his chair, like we were old friends catching up instead of two people meeting for the first time. He wasn't rude, exactly, but there was something off about his demeanor. He barely made eye contact, like he was distracted or thinking about something else entirely. When we started talking, his answers were short, vague, almost rehearsed. It felt like he had been on 100 dates before this one and wasn't even bothering to pretend like he cared anymore. Then the waiters came over, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. He didn't look at her. Not once. He ordered without even glancing up, his voice flat and dismissive, like she wasn't a real person. I always pay attention to how a guy treats waitstaff, and this was a bad sign. But I brushed it off. Maybe he was just awkward. Maybe he was having a bad day. The conversation didn't improve. He asked me barely anything about myself, just kept steering the topic back to himself, but in this weirdly detached way. He talked about money a lot. Not in a bragging way, but more like he was obsessed with it. Like he had something to prove. He kept mentioning how people get scammed all the time, how businesses overcharge, how he always finds a way to come out on top. It didn't sit right with me, but I nodded along, just trying to get through the meal. Then the food came, and he ate fast. Too fast, barely chewing, just shoveling it down like he was racing against some invisible clock. Meanwhile, I was barely halfway through my plate when he leaned back, sighed like he was already over the whole thing, and pulled out his wallet. That's when things got really weird. When the check arrived, he grabbed it before I could even reach for it. At first, I thought, oh, maybe he's one of those guys who insists on paying, but something about his expression made me pause. He was too casual, too smug. Like he wasn't just paying, he was playing a game. He pulled out a few bills, placed them on the check, and slid it back toward the edge of the table like it was nothing. But the moment I saw the money, I knew something was wrong. The bills didn't look right. It wasn't something you'd notice immediately unless you were really looking, but something about the paper seemed off. The colors were just slightly too bright. The texture seemed too smooth. My stomach dropped. I didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension settle over me. I glanced up at him, and he was watching me now, finally making eye contact. His lips curled slightly in amusement. Like he knew asterisk I noticed, but didn't care. I told myself maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then the waiters came back, picked up the check, and walked away. A minute passed, then another. Then she came back, this time with the manager. And that's when everything fell apart. The manager had the bills in his hand, holding them up to the light, his face unreadable. He asked Chris if he had another form of payment. Chris just stared at him like he couldn't believe he was being questioned. Then, without missing a beat, he started arguing. Not loudly and not angrily, but smoothly, like he had done this before. Like he had a whole script in his head about how to handle situations like this. He insisted the money was real. He played dumb. He acted offended. He pulled out his wallet again, shuffled through it like he was going to pull out a card, then hesitated. That's when I knew he didn't have another way to pay. The manager wasn't having it. He gestured toward the back of the restaurant, and that's when I saw them, 2 police officers, standing near the entrance. My chest tightened. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. They had called the cops. Chris looked at them, then back at the manager, and for the first time all night, I saw something crack in his expression. A flicker of something, annoyance, frustration, maybe even panic. But it was only for a second. Then he smiled. A fake, forced smile. The kind you give when you know you're screwed, but don't want to admit it. He stood up, hands raised slightly like he was about to explain something. But the officers were already moving toward him. The managers stepped back. The restaurant got quiet. People were staring. I was frozen in my seat, heart pounding. The officers started asking him questions, but his whole demeanor had shifted. He wasn't smug anymore, wasn't indifferent. He was defensive, still trying to talk his way out of it, but they weren't buying it. They asked him to step outside. Then, as if suddenly remembering I was there, he turned to me and grinned. A slow, eerie grin, like this was all just a joke to him. They'd walked out with them. I sat there, staring at the table, my mind racing. The waitress came over, apologized awkwardly, and asked if I still wanted to pay for my meal. I nodded, paid, and left as fast as I could. I never heard from him again. It all started with a strange message on a dating app. Right away, I felt this weird knot in my stomach. She was charming, confident, mysterious, the kind of person you want to meet because she seems like she has a lot of stories to tell. Her profile pictures were nice, and she seemed to have this adventurous vibe, so I was excited. But looking back, there were subtle hints in her messages I should noticed. She kept asking odd questions about my family, my past relationships, nothing too direct, but still probing. I brushed it off, thinking she was just curious. Now I wonder if she was sizing me up. We decided to meet at a diner on the edge of town, a neutral spot, a safe choice. I arrived a few minutes early, picked a booth in the corner, and nervously waited, tapping my foot. I'm usually confident on first dates, but something about this one had me on edge. She showed up about 10 minutes late, walking in quietly and scanning the room like she was looking for someone or something. When she finally saw me, she slid into the booth across from me without saying much. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I tried to make small talk about the weather, but she barely responded, just nodded. When the waitress came over, she ordered the same soda as me, but no food. I thought it was odd, but I didn't say anything. Maybe she wasn't hungry anymore. Our conversation started out pretty normal. I talked about my job at a small tech company, how busy it kept me. She told me she was between jobs, but kept dodging questions about what she did. I'm exploring different opportunities, she said, or it's complicated. It struck me as odd, but I didn't press. We moved on at hobbies. She told me she loved exploring old, abandoned houses, taking pictures, and posting them online. It sounded cool, even a little unique, until she mentioned that she went alone, at night. She seemed to find that exciting, and a chill ran down my spine. The whole time, she fiddled with her phone, checking it constantly, opening and closing the screen. At one point, her phone rang, and she immediately sent it to voicemail without a word. She didn't apologize, just casually dove back into talking about a time she'd broken into an old hospital wing to take pictures. She described the peeling walls, the gurneys left behind, and her excitement about the whole thing. She even got a gleam in her eye while telling it. I didn't know what to say, but it all felt wrong. I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but she went right back to her nighttime adventures, claiming she never got scared. She said she once heard footsteps echoing in the dark corridors of an abandoned hospital, but she kept going. She found it thrilling. I tried to shift gears again, but she was relentless. When I asked if she went with friends, she said they just slowed her down. I was starting to feel more and more uneasy. She wasn't just fearless. She seemed to enjoy danger. My food arrived, but I hardly touched it. She wasn't eating at all, just sipping her soda and occasionally stealing fries off my plate. Every time she did, she kept eye contact with me in this strange way, almost like she was daring me to say something. I tried to laugh it off, but the whole situation felt invasive. The diner was mostly empty with just us, a waitress, and one other guy slumped in a corner booth. The silence between us was thick, the fluorescent lights above flickering now and then. She excused herself to the restroom, leaving her phone face down on the table. I noticed it light up twice while she was gone. The first time, I saw a name flash on the screen. Brian. The second time, it was someone named Jared. I thought about looking closer, but I didn't. It was none of my business, right? She came back, sat down, and her phone started buzzing again, right on the table. Without looking, she swiped at the screen, ignoring it. She casually asked if I wanted to go for a drive. I hesitated, something about her tone making me uneasy. But I didn't want to make things awkward, so I agreed. We finished up at the diner, and I paid the bill because she claimed she forgot her wallet. Another red flag, but by that point, I couldn't keep track of all the warning signs. Outside, the air felt too heavy, like something was off. She led me to her car, a beat-up old sedan with one headlight barely working. The interior was cluttered with random stuff: boxes, water bottles, clothes. It smelled damp, like the car had been left in the rain with the windows cracked. She started driving, taking random turns down unfamiliar roads. I kept asking where we were going, but she just said, "It's a surprise." Normally I'd find that fun, but tonight it felt ominous. Her phone kept buzzing. She glanced at it, then pressed something on the screen without looking. I felt more and more on edge, wondering if I should have asked to just go back to my car. She turned off onto a deserted side road, stopped the car, and cut the engine. There was nothing around but fields and leafless trees. I glanced at her, and she just stared ahead for a long time. Then she finally turned to face me, her expression blank, her eyes piercing. She started telling me about an old barn nearby that she claimed was haunted. She said she'd taken pictures there before, capturing orbs she believed were spirits. I barely listened as she scrolled through her phone's gallery, showing me dark, eerie photos of abandoned places. Some of the pictures looked like they might have been of people sleeping, which made my stomach drop, but she was scrolling too fast for me to make out details. Then her phone rang again. This time she answered, but she didn't keep her voice low. I could hear her talking to someone, telling them she might be open to meeting up later, maybe working things out if he was mature about it. "I miss you too," she said, then laughed. Right in front of me. It felt like I was invisible. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed silent, waiting for her to finish. When she hung up, she said it was her ex and that he was just worried about her, but it wasn't a big deal. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, and I couldn't take it anymore. I told her I wanted to go home. I couldn't handle it. Instead of an apology, she just nodded, turned the wheel, and drove me back to the diner in silence. When we arrived, I practically jumped out of the car as soon as she stopped. She didn't say a word, just picked up her phone again. I slammed the door, or at least closed it firmly, and felt a shiver run down my spine as I walked to my car. I drove home, still trying to make sense of the night. Everything about her had been unsettling, but it was how she treated me like I wasn't even there, how cold and distant she was, that really stuck with me. I never heard from her again, and I never reached out. I still get a knot in my stomach thinking about that night, especially her eyes in the car, and the fact that she was talking to her ex the whole time. It felt like I was just a placeholder for someone else. I don't know what her deal was, but I'm glad I got out of it. I don't want to experience something like that again. The whole thing was too creepy, and I'm just thankful it didn't get worse. I still remember the weird jolt of excitement I felt when we first matched on that dating app. It was late at night, and I was half asleep, considering deleting the app altogether. Then I saw her profile, and something about her pictures made me pause. She didn't look like she was trying too hard, and her bio was short but intriguing. I sent a quick message, not expecting much. She responded almost immediately, and we chatted for a while before she suggested meeting up the following weekend. I thought it was bold that she wanted to meet so soon, but I was curious. I didn't get any bad vibes from the conversation, so I figured, why not? She picked a local cafe I'd never been to, in a part of town I rarely visited. The photos online made it look cozy though, so I agreed. On the day of the date, I arrived about 15 minutes early as usual to grab a good seat and calm my nerves. The cafe had a warm, laid-back vibe, and I found a small table by the window, hoping I could watch the world outside as I waited. I was fidgety, glancing up every time someone opened the door, wondering if the next person walking in was her. Eventually, she showed up, wearing a sweater and jeans, looking pretty much like her photos, though she had a slightly tense expression I couldn't quite place. She greeted me with a quick smile, but I noticed she kept checking her phone. I asked if she had trouble finding the place, trying to break the ice, but her answers were polite but distant, like she wasn't fully present. I felt a small prick of concern, but I shrugged it off. Maybe she'd had a rough day. We ordered drinks, and I tried to lighten the mood by mentioning the pastries, but she didn't seem interested. Her phone sat on the table, and she kept glancing at it, almost like she was waiting for something urgent. When the phone rang, she picked it up immediately. She muttered something I couldn't make out, then stood up and walked outside. I sat there, sipping my coffee, feeling increasingly awkward. The cafe was busy, and I tried not to think about the other people who were probably noticing that I was alone. I looked out the window, and as she was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, her expression more upset by the minute. After a while, I expected her to come back in, but she stayed outside, still on the phone. I felt like I was stuck in a weird limbo, unsure if I should wait or just leave, but I stayed put, trying to calm my racing thoughts. She finally returned, looking more flustered than before. She said it was an emergency with a friend, but it didn't sound convincing. She launched into a rant about family drama, an ex who wouldn't stop texting her, and some old roommate who owed her money. She sounded really stressed, and I tried to be a good listener. I asked if she was okay, if maybe she wanted to reschedule, but she shook her head and insisted she wanted to be there. Then, as if on cue, her phone rang again. She immediately apologized and walked outside once more, her face tight with frustration. At that point, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a bad day. There was something bigger going on. I tried to keep myself busy, asking the barista for a refill and reminding myself that I was still on a date. But the longer she was gone, the more uncomfortable I felt. I kept checking the window, and every time, there she was, arguing with someone on the phone, looking more upset. It went on for what felt like forever, and I started to wonder if I'd end up leaving alone. When she finally came back in, there was no explanation. She just sat down, looking exhausted, and apologized again. She said that her life had gotten really complicated lately, and that she was just trying to deal with everything. I asked if she wanted to take a break or leave, but she shook her head, saying she really wanted to make it work. She was still checking her phone every few seconds, clearly on edge, and it felt like she wasn't even there with me anymore. Then her phone rang again. Without missing a beat, she picked it up and leaned over the table, speaking in a low, heated voice. I could barely make out the words, but caught phrases like, "How could you do this to me? And I'm not going to just let this go." She was angry, and the tension in her voice made me feel more and more like I was intruding on something private. She locked eyes with me while she spoke, and it was so surreal that I didn't know how to react. I tried to keep my cool, but I felt like everyone in the cafe was staring at us. There we were, supposed to be on a date, and instead, I was a bystander to her personal meltdown. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. The argument went on for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only around 20 minutes. When it finally ended, she took a deep breath, said a few more angry words into the phone, and hung up. The atmosphere around our table was suffocating. She looked at me with tired eyes and apologized again, saying that whoever she'd been talking to had caused a huge problem in her life. She promised things would be fine once it was resolved. I nodded, not sure what else to say. I tried to steer the conversation to something lighter, asking about her week, but she didn't seem to care. Her eyes kept flicking to her phone, and I could tell she wasn't really listening. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. She gave me an apologetic look and muttered something about needing to step outside again. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just leave, but I didn't want to be rude. I stayed seated, trying to figure out how I could salvage what was left of this disastrous date. When she came back in, I could see the emotional toll it had taken on her. She looked drained, like she had no energy left for anything, even this date. She fiddled with her phone, opening and closing apps, avoiding eye contact. I asked her if she wanted to wrap things up, and she nodded, almost relieved. She said she couldn't focus on the date anymore. I paid for our drinks, eager to get out of there, and she offered to pay me back, but I waved it off. It wasn't about the money, I just wanted to leave. We walked out of the cafe together, the cold air hitting me like a wave. She muttered something about needing to sort out her personal issues before she could date anyone. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. We said a quick goodbye on the sidewalk, and she walked off, tapping away at her phone. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. It was the strangest first date I'd ever had, and I couldn't decide if I should feel sorry for her or freaked out. Maybe both. I went home feeling drained. The entire evening replayed in my head, from her constant phone checks to the intense argument in the cafe. It was uncomfortable, and I felt like I was just a passive observer in her emotional chaos. I never reached out after that, and I didn't expect to. Sometimes I think back to that day, not because I want closure, but because it was a reminder of how unpredictable meeting new people can be. And sometimes, no matter how much you want to forget, certain memories stick with you. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen.